the old neighborhood. If you're driving to Parkland from downtown, your best bet is to take the Dan Ryan Expressway, I-57, which cleaves like a wide river with a bend here and a... My name is Eric Charles May, the author of Bedrock Faith, the 2021 One Book, One Chicago selection by the Chicago Public Library.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our first virtual mainstage event for the 2021 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, and the book Bedrock Faith by Eric Charles May. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for other upcoming programs, reading recommendations, on-demand video content, and more coming now through the end of the year. Tonight's program is possible, and One Book, One Chicago is generously funded by donations to the Chicago Public Library Foundation. Visit cplfoundation.org for information on how you can get involved with their work. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one. Now for tonight's event. When you see stories about Chicago on the news, do they ring true for you? Do you see your neighbors and experiences reflected in the media? Tonight, we are so happy to welcome guests from local community media outlets discussing the importance of journalism, media, and culture that comes from and reflects communities. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. Adeshina Emmanuel is the editor-in-chief at Injustice Watch. He was born and raised in the Uptown neighborhood on Chicago's North Side by an African-American mother and a Nigerian father, and studied journalism at Loyola University Chicago. His work over the past decade has spanned hyperlocal and national reporting with a focus on race, class, and institutional injustice. Before coming to Injustice Watch in 2019, Ade covered education at Chalkbeat, was an investigative reporter at the Chicago Reporter, and a neighborhood reporter at DNA Info Chicago. He has also worked with the Chicago Sun-Times and the New York Times. His work has been published by various local and national outlets, including the Chicago Reader, Ebony Magazine, In These Times, the Columbia Journalism Review, Neiman Reports, the Washington Post, Parts Unknown, and the Southside Weekly. Arionne Nettles is City Bureau's deputy editor. Born and raised on the South Side, she's a culture reporter and a journalism lecturer at Northwestern's Medill School, and has held editorial roles at the Chicago Defender, the Associated Press, and WBEZ. Joshua Smyser-DeLeon is a Chicago-born Baruca with strong passion for public service, Puerto Rican culture, and storytelling. He's the founder and host of the Paseo Podcast, a bi-weekly podcast dedicated to highlighting stories from, by, and about the Puerto Rican community. He started the podcast project to archive the stories of the Puerto Rican community, rarely covered in traditional media, from the island to the Chicago diaspora and beyond. His day job is working in public relations, and he's held previous roles in local government and higher education, including his past roles as a communication director for Chicago's first ward alderman, Daniel Laspada, and as a Latinx outreach coordinator for DePaul University. In his spare time, he volunteers with the Puerto Rican Agenda Chicago chapter and does woodworking to create art pieces rooted in Latin American culture and representation. Tonia Hill is a multimedia journalist from the South Side of Chicago. She is passionate about crafting narratives about the people and the places in Chicago that inspire her. Currently, she produces and writes Triibe's TV show, We Real Chicago, highlighting Black Chicagoans in the arts and entertainment scene. When she's not working on Triibe TV, she reports on a variety of topics, including Luke James, local nonprofits, and early Black Chicago history for thetribe.com. Before joining the Tribe, she was a freelance producer at WTTW's Chicago Tonight. And finally, Shawn Campbell is the founder and general manager of CHIRP Radio, Chicago's independent community radio station. She has 3 decades of broadcast experience, including 8 years as program director at WLUW and a stint as a producer and reporter at WBEZ. She's also been a news writer and anchor, a DJ, a music director, and a news director. She has a BA in speech communication theater from North Central College and an MA in radio, TV, film from Northwestern University. She can be heard on the air at CHIRP 107.1 FM and chirpradio.org on Saturdays from 12 to 3. Welcome to our panelists. Before we begin, I want to note for transparency that I am personally a fan of each of your media outlets, and I have been either a subscriber, a reader, or a donor for every single one of them, and I also volunteer at CHIRP. So hopefully that makes me a good person to moderate tonight's panel. Let's talk about community media. So I thought we'd start by telling us a little bit about your media outlet and its goals, mission, and how it got started. So do we want to start with Ade? You want to tell us a little bit about Injustice Watch?
Hey, Jennifer, thanks so much for having me. So Injustice Watch was founded in 2015 by 2 investigative journalists, Rick Toski and Rob Warden. They really saw a need for more investigative journalism in Chicago and a need for more coverage of the court system, which is often challenging to cover for a lot of journalists, but is very significant, as we know, and has very far-reaching influence and impact on people's lives. So one of our just very cornerstone products, or I guess services that we provide as public service journalists, is the judicial election guides that we put out every election that gives background on the different judges that are on your ballot. I think it's a really important and powerful thing. And it's sort of an act of public service journalism that I think is really, especially important today in Chicago and in Cook County, and always has been, certainly. But yeah, I think that we really just are trying to figure out how to be responsive to the community in a way that helps shed light on institutional barriers to justice that that I think are really at the root of a lot of the things that we see people in the streets and people who have been living in Chicago for decades talk about when they talk about systems of oppression and institutional injustice in the city. So yeah, that's sort of us. There's a lot more, but usually I talk too much already, so I'll pass it off.
Well, great. Tonia, you want to go next?
Sure, and thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me. So the Tribe was started by 2 best friends, Morgan Elise Johnson and Tiffany Walden, and they created it out of a need because there was a lack of Black stories and Black voices. And a lot of times, if you just go back, the Tribe started in 2017 also, but at that time, there was a lot of focus on Chicago's violence, and there wasn't real reporting or coverage on the root causes of violence as well. And some of what the work that we want to do, that we do at the Tribe, is to unify the Black community, uplift them, and just document the wins, the challenges, and in a way that I feel like sometimes mainstream media doesn't do. So it's all about unifying Black Chicagoans and connecting them with their history. Something just like, that I've been thinking about too, in some of the work that we did this year with our Tribe Guide, we looked at Black Chicago from the 1800s, and a lot of our history, where our story kind of starts at the Great Migration. And we learned that, we've been here since the 1800s. So all of the problems and the struggles that Black people are encountering today are similar to what our ancestors went through at that time. So it's just all about connecting us to our history and unifying us so that we can show Black people, in their fullest form. So yeah, thank you.
That's great. Wonderful. Arionne, how about you next?
Thank you so much for having me. So City Bureau was founded in 2015 by 4 local Chicago journalists. And we are a nonprofit journalism lab. And for us, really what is kind of the foundation, I would say, of City Bureau is the idea that there needs to be community engagement involved in journalism. We know that communities are capable of, telling their own stories as well. Like there are no heroes in journalism. And, the idea that so much of what we know in our industry to be true about journalism being a transactional thing, people come to a neighborhood, you get an information and you get stories and then you leave, that is not what we aim to do. We aim to kind of equip people in communities to tell stories. We do that through our fellowship program, where we train people of all levels, people who have never tried to do journalism before, as well as people who have years of experience. And we train you how to do what we think need to do. How do you find information? How do you become more civically involved? We also do that with our documenters program, where we kind of are able to kind of deploy people across the city to go to public meetings, take notes, and share what's happening in our city. So our thought is that, hey, Chicago is our city. It belongs to all of us, and we all deserve to be involved and to have this information and to have these tools. And so that is really what we do.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry, we're having a little bit of difficulty with the picture here, so hang in there, folks, but hopefully you can all hear us. I should also note that the City Bureau Documenters program does a lot of trainings at the Chicago Public Library. So look at their website and look at the library website for more information on that. Joshua, do you want to tell us? Sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty here, so I'll just talk for a little bit more. Sorry, this is always the problem with community media, right? We're all scrappy little folks just trying to make the little thing work. So yeah, so definitely check out the Documenters program, which I know many library patrons have attended and learned about how to do community media, how to cover meetings in their ward or in their neighborhood, and to empower people who maybe didn't have the opportunity for formal education in to become journalists. So Joshua, tell us a little bit about Paseo Podcast.
Yeah, first off, super happy to be here with all these amazing panelists. Jennifer, very grateful to get that email in my inbox inviting me to be a part of this event tonight. Really means a lot to me, it means a lot to the Paseo Podcast. But in short, I'm the founder and host of the Paseo Podcast. We're an independent organization based in Chicago's historic Paseo Boricua, located in Humboldt Park on Division Street. Our mission is to create audio and video content by, from, and about the Puerto Rican community, not just here in Chicago, although a lot of our stories are very much rooted here in the Chicago Boricua community, but we really cover stories throughout the Puerto Rican diaspora here in the United States, around the world really, and on La Isla, on the island. I founded the podcast back in 2019, so we're a baby of an organization. And it really came about through this capstone project I had to do for my master's program. I wasn't really a fan of the capstone. It felt like I was being asked to do something in digital media that was very finite. And I really wanted to do something that was reflective of my identity, that was true to my culture, that brought me joy. So I just started reflecting, doing some research, talking to people in the Puerto Rican community here in Chicago to see if anything like a podcast existed that archived and highlighted stories for us, by us, and noticed that there was a bit of a black hole. We didn't have that. So really wanted to have a platform to lift up those voices that aren't really given the attention that they deserve in traditional media. I also grew up in Humboldt Park, born and raised there, born and raised here in Chicago, was really involved in activities that happened on Paseo Boricua, were run by Chicago's Puerto Rican Cultural Center. And that really gave me a space to learn more about my culture beyond the classroom, because in the classroom, there's probably about 2 pages on Puerto Rico, and it was all about how America saved Puerto Rico from Spain, which is not true. Fun fact, everybody. But if it wasn't for those conversations that I was having with people in the community, it would never have opened my eyes to the beauty that is our history, and how over the years our history has really been watered down to reflect a narrative of our people that really isn't true or reflective of the history and the struggle that our people have gone through over the decades. And to the point right now where we're the longest held colony in the world. But we don't really talk about that in traditional media. So the Paseo Podcast gives us outlets to talk about heavier things like that, like policy, but also lighter things like Boricua artists that are doing really cool activities, initiatives in their communities, people that are community organizers, journalists, you name it. We have a really cool coalition of guests that come on and really show the different layers that exist in our community and that make up our community.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And then finally, Shawn, tell us a little bit about CHIRP Radio.
Sure. And like everyone else, so glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me. CHIRP is a music-focused, listener-supported, volunteer-driven community radio station. I'm the one staff person. We have about 250 volunteers. So everyone that you hear on the air, for the most part, other than me, is a volunteer. And we really are focused on playing local music, independent music you won't necessarily find on your mainstream commercial outlets. We have a true belief in great independent local music. We play local music every single hour of every day. You know, a lot of radio stations play local music maybe for 1 hour once a week, but local music is an intrinsic part of what we do. The organization actually dates all the way back to 2007. We started out wanting to build from the ground up a truly independent radio station for Chicago. At that time, Chicago was the largest city in the country that didn't have a truly independent radio outlet. There were and are many radio stations that are affiliated with universities, and but none that were freestanding. So we started out just raising money and raising awareness. We actually had to work to pass a bill through Congress. We joined with a lot of national organizations and local low power FM organizations to expand low power FM radio, which is radio stations licensed at 100 watts, to big cities. We passed our bill in 2010. We got to lead a White House meeting on the issue of low power FM. And then we launched our station in the streaming version in 2010, January of 2010, and had to go through all of the government red tape to apply for a broadcast license, a federal broadcast license from the FCC. Finally got there in October of 2017 when we launched at 107.1 FM. And we always say that radio done well makes you feel slightly less alone in the world. And this past year has absolutely been a true test of that, because we are always live and local every day of the year, every hour from 6 a.m. until midnight, with DJs broadcasting live in real time. And we heard so much from our listeners about how much that's meant to them during the pandemic, to have that sense of connection. And that's really what we're all about, is connecting with our community.
That's wonderful, Shawn. And you kind of lead into the next question that I was going to ask, which is a common complaint that everyone kind of hears, and I'm sure you've all heard it about the media, is that it doesn't reflect real people's experiences. And I was wondering how each of you would respond to people who think that radio, TV, or newspapers are no longer relevant to their lives. Shawn, I know you have said many times, I've heard you say, you know, people didn't leave radio, radio left people. So I wonder if you could talk about that, if you want to start us off on that.
Sure, absolutely. That's something that I've said many, many times in different speeches and presentations and things. Radio is a super powerful medium. It's intimate, it's immediate, it's cheap to produce. But what we've seen is that audience has been leaving radio. And a big part of the reason that the audience has been leaving is because radio is abandoning these traditional strengths that it has. Less and less radio actually is live in real time. There are more and more commercials and more repetition. So what we really embrace at CHIRP is the idea that radio should be live and local and connected to its community. We want to be the people who, you feel like if you go see a show, if you go see a band, we're standing next to you seeing that band. When we're talking about a nonprofit organization in the community or a local independent business in the community, we're talking about it because it means something to us and we have a relationship and we think it would be important to you too. We're not talking about stuff because someone paid us to talk about it. We don't have any advertising. We're a non-commercial radio station. By nature, there are no commercials. And so what we find is that it's truly having those voices on the air who clearly are familiar with the communities they're talking about. You know, a lot of radio also has what they call voice tracking now, and people will be recording their breaks ahead of time, and they might be in a completely different city. So it can be something as simple as hearing somebody say Devon instead of Devon in talking about a place name, you know, and giving a traffic report. But we think that when you really base your work in the community that you're seeking to reach, people value that and people seek it out in a way that that they're, you know, at the same time they're abandoning a lot of bigger commercial media. The people who those values mean something to, they seek out smaller media outlets who hold the values that they do.
That's great. Yeah. I wonder if anybody else on the panel had some thoughts about that. Arionne, I know that that's sort of a cornerstone of what City Bureau does is, you know, kind of getting people in the community to learn how to do actual reporting on their neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many of us who have worked in media, you know, even here in Chicago, we know that our industry, when you go into many, many newsrooms, they don't reflect the diversity of backgrounds of our city. You know, Chicago is this amazing, beautiful place, but if you go into a newsroom and you don't see those people that can reflect that, then that's going to affect the coverage that you see in your newspapers, on your TV, on your radio. And, you know, I like to say that we are an industry where the people who make it reflect what the product is. And so it's really important to kind of push people into the industry that, you know, like I think someone mentioned earlier, regardless of your background, your training, like it should be an industry that should be more accessible. There shouldn't be one or two ways into it. And that has really, you know, kind of guided how journalism looks here in our city. And so I think that any program or programs, or a lot of us, I think in the nonprofit journalism world, we found that we have been more open to being able to pull in people, to create fellowship programs, to create, you know, on the job training so that our products do address people. And, you know, for us significantly, we have a great focus on the South and West sides.
That's great. Ade, I wonder if you would want to speak to kind of the importance of reflecting real people in the work that Injustice Watch does.
Yeah, I mean, I would second everything that's been said so far, and also say, before I get into what I'm doing at Injustice Watch and how that ties in, I'm also a City Bureau alum, and I think that something that I learned at City Bureau was sort of like another school of thought, I guess, that sort of helped me reprogram myself in some ways when I think about the education that I did have and how I was socialized into journalism and trained in journalism, you know, and really centering community and the impact in the community. And I think that that is what, you know, we do at Injustice Watch, that we really are trying to figure out how can we reflect, well, one, from a structural perspective, I mean, helping people understand the legal system, the criminal legal system, which is something that I think if you're of the dominant class, you're moneyed, you're able to navigate with a lot more effectiveness. And I think that broad swaths of the community here in Cook County and Chicago don't navigate these systems with as much ease or receive as much leniency. And you see disparities in police contacts and who's over policed and who ends up being funneled into the system. And I think that one part of reflecting in the community is reflecting the need in the community and where you take your cues from should not be from individuals in power. It should be from the people who are directly impacted. So that's one part of reflection. It's maybe a bit more abstract, but I think it's direct to what we all do when we think about public service as a product we provide, right? So that's important to reflect. I think there's unity in that because that's sort of offsetting, I think, what we see, what's already been said about the lack of diversity in media and who's creating the product. I mean, it's going to reflect the society in ways that further whatever systems of oppression and inequities we see, right? So when you look in newsrooms and don't see young people, women, queer people, Black people, Latinos, Asians, in this, behind the steering wheel, so to speak, I mean, you're only going to see, I don't want to generalize too, because there are allies, there are people who I think, do right by folks, but ultimately it's not an orientation that will dismantle anything or change things, So I found it very powerful to be a Black man who is, also, my father is from Nigeria, of an immigrant background, who didn't grow up in money, but who I think, I came up through CPS, and I often think about the folks who I've sort of not left behind, but the other little kids around me, when I was a kid. And I'm thinking like, oh, wow, Ade grew up enjoying the media in Chicago. And you understand how we're depicted in the media and in the communities. And I've made it a point to just not be special, not to be someone who just I'm in here, so that's good, right? I think that when journalism organizations are really ready to turn a corner and really reflect the community and maybe offset some of the criticism we see, will be when people can really see themselves, reflected, like we're saying. And it's not just being in the building, because there's terms to diversity sometimes. And I guess that's where the equity and inclusion part comes in, right? Like, you can let me in the building, but then what? A lot of people are set up to fail. There's a lot of gatekeeping. It's hard to sort of get closer to the real sort of faucet, so to speak, about what makes media run in Chicago and why we focus on certain stories and not others, and why we reflect certain communities in certain lights. I'm being kind of vague because, they have to draw me out and get me into specifics or whatnot. But I think that I think that some of that, it's kind of a ramble, but I think that it's really important that we have more people like us in leadership from underrepresented groups and people who have been told to be quiet, or who haven't felt comfortable. And it's important for us to connect with each other. I mean, I think about definitely City Bureau and Triibe, like their organizations that, I ride with, and I've tried to find ways to connect with, because I had relationships and admiration for people who founded it, because I think we were like-minded in certain ways. And I think it's important that the money and the foundation support and just the general, the financial model start to sort of bend toward also believing in those people. That's another point of reflection, maybe. The money has to reflect what we want. And that's a good stopping point.
Speaking of the Triibe, Tonia, do you want to kind of answer to that? Because this question of representation, because the Triibe, really, that's the mission of the organization.
Yes, and this is one of the things that I love about working at the Triibe, is that I'm working with a dynamic group of Black people, and that it was founded by, two brilliant Black women. So just being able to have that already makes me feel good. But I completely understand people not feeling like, things in the media don't reflect their everyday lives. I did feel that way a lot too. Like Ade was saying, growing up. Oh, and I'm also a City Bureau alum. So I just feel like, as a citizen and being a good citizen, a part of that is like being active in your community and knowing what's going on. So for someone who thinks like news and things don't matter, they do matter. Like Mayor Lightfoot just unveiled her budget, for the next year. So that determines how schools are going to be funded, how we fund police and arts and entertainment and other things like that. So it's just like, if you're going to be, we're all here and citizens, we should be active in all the ways that matters with whoever we're in community with. And I think, like, as journalists, our job is to make sure that people understand. We put it in a way that they can understand, and so that they know why it's important. And I think, everyone here is obviously doing that.
And Joshua, do you want to kind of talk about how you talked a little bit before about how you've kind of done that with the podcast?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first off, I couldn't agree more with everybody's responses up to this point. I would definitely say people's feelings towards radio, TV, newspapers, just media in general, they're absolutely correct. I mean, it's a very real feeling. And I think that's what happens when you have a majority of media outlets owned by a handful of companies, frankly, whether that's locally based or on a national scale. I think when that happens, news becomes too cookie cutter, it loses its character. We lose out on reporting in the public interest in a way that invites people into a conversation and offers an opportunity to educate on real issues. I think a great example at a high level view is look at our pulling out of the war in Afghanistan. That received tons of coverage by the media as if it was, and could we have done things better? 100%, no question. But it received tons of reporting in the media as this gigantic disaster, almost subtly pushing the fact that we should still maintain these forever wars. And at the same time, we're dedicating little to no coverage to the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation package that are currently being worked on in Congress, and the backdoor negotiations that are happening by our elected officials to trim what's in those bills. And we're talking about jobs for people. We're talking about childcare. We're talking about things that could have a substantial impact and really pump money to support everyday working people. But instead, the media wants to focus on Afghanistan. Well, who has the most power when it comes to wars? Our military industrial complex. Who has a ton of money? Who has trillions of our hard-earned dollars? The military industrial complex. But when it comes to something that could really affect everyday people's lives, it's almost impossible to see appropriate coverage on it. And to bring it back to like the local Puerto Rican community, reporting on Puerto Rico was super convenient and was all over the news when it came to sticking it to Donald Trump. But we do not even hear a fraction or see a fraction of that reporting on something like Puerto Rico's Fiscal Control Board, which was put into place by the Obama administration. It's called Promesa. And it basically gave an unelected board complete authority to dictate how Puerto Rico spent its money. And that has led to things like schools closing, pensions being cut, health services being obliterated, privatization of utilities that were once owned by the Puerto Rican government, and a gentrification of the island that has basically created Puerto Rico as a tax haven and is pushing Puerto Ricans out of the island in favor of wealthy Americans here in the States. Donald Trump's not in office, so we don't hear about Puerto Rico policy in the news, and Puerto Ricans are American citizens. So it's when we don't emphasize those local stories, have newsrooms that are reflective of the communities being reported on, we're setting ourselves up for disaster and distrust from the general public. And that's why I love being on this panel, because we have a group of passionate people that are based in the community that really have their heads on straight when it comes to how to report and being ingrained with the people they're trying to serve. And I think we just water things down with the way our national and even local stations and media outlets portray the news or present the news to the general public.
That's great. So each of you have been really conscious about involving the communities that you kind of serve in the end product in different ways. So we've talked a little bit about City Bureau has the documenter training program. CHIRP is driven by volunteers. Justice Watch has a whole tip line set up for the public. Can you talk a little bit about the connection that you have to your readers, listeners, viewers, and how you kind of nurture that to make sure that you are representing the community? Anyone want to start?
I can start because mine is super simple. super simple. The way that we engage with the community, first off, all our team members are volunteers. We're a young, scrappy group of Chicago-based volunteers with Puerto Rican roots. Love connecting with our listeners regularly. If people shout us out on social media, of course, you have throw out the handle. Thanks for this comment. Appreciate you listening. I think those little forms of engagement are always awesome to do. But we also have a call to action at the end of our episodes and on our website that if people want to nominate themselves for a story, somebody they know for a story, if they have a tip or have an idea for a story that involves the Puerto Rican community or impacts the Puerto Rican community, we have a form where people can submit that. We also regularly say people can reach out by DMing us on social media or shooting us an email on our with our Gmail address. So again, super simple, nothing too elaborate. It's just, hey, reach out to us if you have an idea. We got nothing but time for you.
That's great. Anyone else want to kind of talk about your connection to your, yeah, go ahead, Arionne. Or Tonia, sorry.
Go ahead, Tonia, I'll go after you.
Okay, I was just gonna say, like, our viewers and our readers and viewers and everything, we get a lot of feedback from Instagram and Twitter. So that's where a lot of our engagement comes from. And the people that are in our community, that's how we get story ideas. We got some story ideas and tips from Twitter. And pre-COVID, we used to host Triibe Tuesdays in person, and that, brought out 50 to 75 people sometimes would come through and engage with us in discussion. And just, we hope that we'll be able to bring that back in person in the spring, but that's really all I had to add there. But yeah.
And Arionne, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the documenters program and the City Bureau work again.
Yeah, absolutely. So through documenters, which of course is the program where we train people to cover public meetings, through our fellowship program where we train people to be journalists, and through our public newsrooms, which are events that we invite different people from different parts of the community to kind of come together and talk about stuff. It really is kind of like our open door, everyone please come and let's talk events. Through all of those, though, we have a specific goal each time to not just create content for our communities, but to also involve them. So if we're doing something really important about pollution in Little Village, what Little Village organizations are we going to work with? If we are creating a guide to help people not be evicted from their homes, what organizations can help us disseminate that information, right? And how can we also go out into the community and talk to people and ask them what questions they have, what fears do they have, what things do they think they need more information about? So I think that is one thing that's really unique about City Bureau compared to other places that I've personally worked with, is just that, that constant decision to center people in the communities that we want to serve, and not maybe decide what's best for them, but make sure that they're involved with the storytelling process from beginning to end.
And it certainly seems to work because we have a couple of City Bureau alumni here on this panel too, right? Who've gone on to things that
who are amazing. Yeah,
Ade, speaking of alumni, Ade, you want to kind of talk a little bit about how Injustice Watch involves the community with the reporting that you do?
Yeah, sure. And sorry, I changed location. Sorry if it creates a weird lack of continuity. It's kind of jumpy, right?
All right.
But anyway, yeah, so, we get a lot of tips from people, both who are incarcerated people and their families, and a lot of folks in the legal community, and people who work in or are affected by the system. I think the founders of this organization were both folks who are very responsive to all of those individuals, and it can be hard, just the sheer volume of outreach that we get around just injustice happening, everything from water in a prison being unhealthy to some of the policies we saw during COVID. Well, we're still there. We're still deep in the thick of it. I'm speaking of more so the beginning and onset of the pandemic. That was especially a period where we were hearing about, for instance, in Stateville prison, folks being transported to the F house, like the old roundhouse that had been closed and had not been used in a while and was, by some accounts, potentially environmentally unsafe for folks. And, so we get a lot of those tips. We also I believe we try to support our journalism with smart engagement in a lot of the ways that you see a city bureau or a ProPublica even do when we are doing an investigation. For instance, like right now, we're looking into the Aurora police. Our reporter, Rita Osigera, put together just a short piece with a survey saying, have you had an experience with Aurora police? And would you like to share that with us? And then we're doing an investigation. And I think that, there are people who have never really, oh, sorry. Yeah,
you're getting a tip right now.
Yeah, maybe that is. But no, there are people who have never been asked about their experience with a certain institution or, whether it's policing or schools or the correctional system. And when you talk about greater Chicagoland and even, the suburbs as well, there are people of color, there are a lot of folks who are still sort of suffering injustices out there. So, and there are judges out there as well. So something that we've done is trying to kind of integrate our engagement approach with our journalism to strengthen our investigations, but also, again, reflect the real experiences of people in the community and what they say is a need. And I think getting there before the point of outcry is really important, and having a relationship, not just coming in when you need something, being extractive. Being relational can be tough because it takes time. It takes resources to be there. It takes a lot of intention too. A lot of emotional intelligence as well. And I think that journalists, something that we've really ingrained, especially since the pandemic began and since the events of last summer and the death of George Floyd, we've really thought about what are ways, one, that we can pass the mic and let people tell their own stories. We've also thought about how we can really build relationships. And sometimes that means that you build fewer relationships, which is how relationships work, right? But it's like, it means maybe you can't just do everything and be everywhere and churn out a whole bunch of content and do it in a way that's meaningful for people. We're still figuring it out, like everyone. So I think our approach is evolving, and we're learning a lot from partners as well, and how they communicate with their audiences. And I think that that's one great thing, that partnerships is a way that we kind of use. We really, it's great when you can partner with another organization and you all both want to reach an audience together, and maybe they have a relationship or maybe you have a relationship. I guess it's still looking for a channel so you don't have to just cold call, come in, sort of parachute in and out, but it's better to have an intermediary, which is, I think about personally, we really want to grow our audience amongst, Black and brown millennials and people of color. And we've connected with the Triibe and, around even just educating folks about the judicial election process. So rather than us be over here and try to act like we're something you like already, there is sort of, and I think this is dangerous because partnerships can be very extractive. I'm cool, but I will say there are folks who want to come in and just kind of siphon off your audience and talk to the people you talk to who trust you, and that's tricky. And since that's tricky, I don't have anything more to say. I think that's a point of conversation. Maybe I'm curious how other people approach that. Partnering, because we all say, we like each other and it makes sense to partner. We're like-minded. I think that, there's a lot of danger there too, because there are folks who might swoop in from whether it's national or some of the bigger legacy papers, and they, maybe I've said too much.
Or maybe just not enough. Who knows, right? That's probably a whole nother panel we could do about that. So Shawn, I guess I want to start with you for the next one. Obviously, we've been talking a little bit about, especially in recent years, a lot of consolidation, corporate media, fewer and fewer independent outlets, and of course, much less diversity. We know that the majority of owners of newspapers, TV, and radio are all a very small group of people, primarily composed of white men. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what advice you might give to a student or anyone aspiring to become a DJ or a journalist or a podcast producer who doesn't fit that traditional mold. And if you might even talk about other sort of behind the scenes roles in your organization that aren't necessarily, the DJ, the journalist, the writer, but other parts of keeping a media organization going that people might not have considered.
Well, I think what we're so fortunate to have here in Chicago is you're hearing about all these organizations that have roles for volunteers. And if you're able, and I know not everybody is able to volunteer, but if you can, it is an opportunity to build those skills, to learn about how different media organizations operate. And at CHIRP, we're a volunteer-driven organization. We have 13 different departments that are volunteers managing volunteers. So there are people who've been with our organization who stayed for many years and kind of have taken on more and more responsibilities and roles. And some people do it just because they think it's a fun thing to do. They think it's cool to escape from their regular life. But a lot of people also come to us because they are interested in developing professional skills. And when you think about the most obvious roles, like you said, Jenny, it's being on the air. But only about a third of the volunteers who are at CHIRP are on the air. We have volunteers who run our marketing department. They handle our social media. They do design work for us. We have technology volunteers who handle our tech infrastructure. We have promotions volunteers who handle our relationships with venues and theaters and things like that. And so there are all sorts of opportunities. And I think, like I say, the great thing in a city the size of Chicago is that these opportunities do exist in so many different areas. So you can also really test things out. You can spend a little time with an organization, you can learn a little bit. And if it's not the right fit for you, or if you feel like you've gained the knowledge that you need, you can go on and apply for jobs and bring some skills with you that somebody who wasn't in this environment might not be able to do. But we love to have people come to us and see them go on to do other things. I think that there's a question about competition that you had mentioned too when we were preparing for this panel. And I think what makes us happy is when our people go on and join other media outlets, do big things, not even do big things, just do a whole interesting variety of things. And so that's what we feel like is success for us is, we want to send people out from independent media and help them do as whatever it is that they want to do in the larger media world.
That's great. Tonia, I wondered if you would be willing to talk a bit about what it is to be a multimedia producer. I think maybe, the title that you have is something people might not be sure exactly what that means as part of the Triibe.
Sure. So I came on to the Triibe when I mentioned before we got started with the TV show, launching that. So We Real Chicago. So it's an arts and entertainment show that we started last year. And we've done some really, really great things all through StreamYard and all through a pandemic. So it's been a very interesting time for us to start a show during the pandemic. So one of the things like my job entails is writing scripts for our show, pulling graphics or imagery that, as we're looking here on the screen. So figuring out what people at home want to see alongside people talking. So it's just not, blank space or a talking head. Connecting with guests, interviewing them, prepping them for the show, also prepping the host as well. And some creative things too. So sometimes throughout the year, we found that playing games with our guests was fun. One of my favorite things that we did, we played a game of Who Said That? And if you watch Real Housewives of Atlanta, you know where that reference is coming from. So we did that with Black movie, iconic Black comedic shows with some comedians we had on back in March. So that was fun, just having a quote out there and them trying to figure out what movie it came from. But to the point of someone listening that's interested in journalism and other roles that exist outside of, just writing and shooting, I think something else to consider too is what we've all been talking about is building someone to be an outreach coordinator. We have a position like that at the Triibe, someone who is connected to different organizations like at City Bureau that can, you're working on trying to help people figure out what they can do for rent relief. So connecting with those organizations and those organizers and in a city like Chicago, there's always somebody doing the work. So it's just a matter of connecting with them to help people. And I also think too, the tech side of journalism is important. So I don't know how to design a website. I think our website, because of David, so shout out to David at the Triibe, but yeah, like just the tech side of it, laying out a website, figuring out how you can turn a print story and make it interactive for audiences to interact with as they're reading. Graphics, being able to look at data and understand it, and then being able to turn that data into, fancy graphs or things like that. So I think those are all like different skills that people can bring in that are outside of the traditional, just like writing or, being on air. But I will also say too, like there is a place for you, and don't feel as if there isn't. And I think that's something I had to learn too. There was a place for me. I just had to find it, and I found it.
That's great. We have a couple more minutes. So I'm going to throw out another question and you guys can kind of respond to the last two together. But much of the consolidation in media is driven by the challenges of making a profit in a time when fewer people subscribe to their newspaper, fewer people are buying the newspaper. There's some other consolidation issues that cause those sort of financial models to be more challenging. So I wondered if you could each talk just a little bit about the financial models that your organization uses to fund your work. So Shawn, do you want to start?
Sure. Since we're in the middle of a pledge drive, actually we're at the very end of a pledge drive right now, I definitely can talk about fundraising.
And you all feel free to throw out your fundraisers as you answer.
Yeah, we are very much a listener-supported radio station. Like I said before, we're a non-commercial outlet. It's the nature of our license. We couldn't choose to have advertising on the air. So we really look to our listeners, and we've built these connections with our audience members over time where they really do feel this very personal connection to the station. And so we come, we have a great resource with radio because you can speak so directly to people and make the case to them about why it's important to support the service. So we do pledge drives a couple of times a year. In normal non-pandemic times, we also typically do two big events every year, which are record fairs. So this is another way listeners can support us by coming to events. We just did a smaller version of our record fair that we do every year at Pitchfork last weekend. And so that was fun to get out and see people, but we definitely, have had our event schedule, I was going to say scaled back, but it really just hasn't existed for the past 18 months. And then we get some foundation support, but really at the heart of it right now, about 75% of all our funding comes from listener donations and other ways that listeners can support us, selling merchandise, donating vehicles, things like that.
And Joshua, how does the Paseo podcast, how does that, kind of work behind the scenes with funding?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is we're working on it. Primarily, we are also a listener-supported organization. There are a couple of partners like the Chicago Independent Media Alliance and the Chicago Puerto Rican Cultural Center that both have opportunities for us to get money from them. But really, it's really benefiting from the kindness of people's wallets. We have a way for people to do that, paseomedia.org, quick little plug there. Just hit the donate tab and the Chicago, you'll be taken to a Chicago Independent Media Alliance website that they actually created for us so that people could give a donation if they like what they hear. And then we're currently applying to a few local and national grants. When I started the podcast, it was just me. So I was doing the web design, the graphic design, the production, the audio editing, the publicist work, the writing, social media management, you name it. I kind of had to wear all those hats. And now that we have a pretty scrappy, strong volunteer group of 5, I'm a big believer in fair pay for fair work. So really want to try and explore what grant opportunities are out there for us so we can start putting money in people's pockets for the time they dedicated to the podcast. So so still a work in progress.
And Ade, how about Injustice Watch? How does that work?
Well, we really rely on the hope that people find value in what we do, and we rely on the support of our readers. most of our funding comes from individual supporters, folks who give gifts of all sizes from $5 to $5,000. We get some funding from foundations, corporate sponsors, but primarily do rely on support of our community and of people who find value in our work. And we're very focused on growing sustainably. So we take fewer swings at, I think, big one-time shots of money, and we more so try to sort of build, I think, that sense of value, that value proposition for the community. And I think that our development director, also Amanda Miley, shout out to Amanda. You can't be on here and not shout out the development director. Talking about funding, right? She does a wonderful job of working closely with us to kind of problem solve, so to speak, around what are barriers to our vision. And I think it all does start, it works best when you have something you believe has value and you have folks who agree. And it gets back to those relationships with the community. So it also means we're learning and growing. And it's hard to talk about sustainability in media these days, but we're trying to stay sustainable and stay real with folks.
Absolutely. And Tonia, the Triibe, what's the model for the Triibe's funding?
Sure. Well, I can't speak to specifics exactly. I leave that to our founders, but I will say that we have received grant money in the past, and that we've also received funding or funds from the community that have raised money on our behalf, and we're eternally grateful for that. But our website is free and open to the public, and that was something that was important to our founders, that news not be behind a paywall. But we do have a paid subscription, so we are encouraging people to sign up for our newsletter and subscribe that way. And it's just $10 per month. And you can find out more information about that by visiting the Triibe with 2 eyes.com.
That's great. And finally, Arionne, the City Bureau kind of model, which has been such a success for several of the people on our panel as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we have been able to do what we do because of people who believe in our mission and believe in journalism. So whether that is grants from larger organizations or from, individual donors, we value every single person or organization that kind of like really believes in us. And that support has really allowed us to create our paid fellowships, our paid documentary programs, our paid public newsroom speakers. And so that is really from that type of support. And so you can donate at citybureau.org/donate. That's
great. Well, we're coming to the end of the program, but we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I think we have time for just one. And this is there ever any collaboration between Chicago's smaller news organizations and the area's news titans, such as either a major newspaper or area major network? So have any of you found any collaboration with some of the big hitters or the major or corporate outlets?
I think, well, for us, at least all of the above. That I know we've worked with Southside Weekly, City Bureau, Cicero Independiente, the Triibe, but we've also worked with Sun Times, and we have a partnership with AP through INN, and we've talked with other legacy outlets. I think a lot of it's very relational. And to be honest, for me personally, a lot of it has been with other people of color and women and queer folks who were in power in a place. And we said, oh, hey, look, you're new. And I think that that's what's beautiful about Chicago. There's still people here, for better and for worse, still pushing. There's always someone to connect with if you're right, and they're right. But I mentioned the point about, I made an ominous point about partnerships earlier and how they can be horribly extractive and inequitable too. So there's a lot of perspectives on that. That's just mine.
How about anybody else? Would you like to talk a little bit about other partnerships you might have had with other media organizations in town or out of town?
Not necessarily like a traditional partnership with a larger outlet, but we have really made an effort to network with a wider Puerto Rican community, and that's led us to having really what I think are really in-depth discussions on Puerto Rican issues with journalists from places like NBC News, NBC Latino, the Chicago Sun-Times. We've also even had journalists from City Bureau, the Chicago Reader on to talk about Puerto Rican issues. So not quite a partnership, but we don't poo-poo having someone that's from another outlet on the show. If anything, we have more of an open door policy. If you're Boricua, you have a empty seat waiting for you in the guest chair to have a really good conversation. So that's really been the extent of our partnerships. On a local scale with independent media, we're a part of the Chicago Independent Media Alliance. We're also looking at a partnership with a local Chicago-based online radio station that plays queer and independent music called E3 Radio, and then a streaming service that's called Boricua Box. It's going to be on Roku for right now. But the founder is based in Chicago. He's also Puerto Rican, and he wanted to create a streaming service that distributes content for the Puerto Rican community by the Puerto Rican community. So we never shy away from a good partnership, but anything on a larger scale or at a grander level, that's not something that we currently do.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time for today. So I just want to say thank you so much to Adeshina Emmanuel, Arionne Nettles, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon, Tonia Hill, and Shawn Campbell for being here with us tonight. Thanks to CPL Tech Leland Mosley for producing tonight's event. And thanks to all of you for being here. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for more information on other upcoming events around our theme, Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, including book discussions, films, author events, art programs, and more. Also visit the CPL YouTube and Facebook pages for on-demand video content, including from tonight's program. So share it with a friend who missed it. Thanks, and have a great week, everyone.